The fist came down so hard the coffee cups rattled. A young woman sat alone in a booth at the far end of a crowded diner, her hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, when the police officer slammed his palm onto her table and leaned in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just looked up at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine, and that stillness, that absolute unreadable calm, made him angrier than anything she could have said. "You deaf?" he said. "I told you to leave." The diner had gone quiet. 20-something people, all of them suddenly very interested in their plates. The woman's name was Nora Callahan. She was 32 years old, still wearing her scrubs from a 12-hour ER shift. And she had done nothing wrong. She had ordered coffee. She had sat down. She had waited for her ride home like 100 other exhausted people do every night in every city in this country. But Officer Dale Pruitt had decided she was a problem. And in the city of Harlow Ridge, when an officer like Pruitt decided you were a problem, most people quietly gathered their things and left. Nora Callahan was not most people. What Officer Pruitt didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that before she ever set foot in a hospital, Nora had spent 6 years attached to a special operations unit in some of the most hostile combat environments on Earth. She had kept soldiers alive under fire. She had made life and death calls in the dark with nothing but her hands and a field kit. She had come home with 2 commendations she never talked about and a set of skills she had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. She looked like a tired nurse. She was something else entirely. And Pruitt was about to make the worst mistake of his career. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the end. Hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you're on Nora's side. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Starlight Diner sat on the corner of Merchant and Fifth in the older part of Harlow Ridge, wedged between a shuttered laundromat and a pharmacy that kept threatening to relocate. It was the kind of place that had been there long enough to feel permanent. Red vinyl booths worn thin at the edges, a long counter with spinning stools, a pie case that still displayed actual pie. The overnight crowd was a mix of shift workers, insomniacs, and the kind of people who just needed somewhere warm to sit for a while. The cook, a heavy-set man named Gus, had been working the grill since 11. The waitress, Paulina, had been on her feet for 9 hours and was running on spite and decaf. Nora had come in just after 2 in the morning, taken a booth near the window, and ordered black coffee. She'd been quiet and unremarkable, which was exactly how she preferred it. She had her phone out, texting her sister about whether it was too late to call, half watching the street outside where the city looked gray and washed out under the sodium lights. She'd been sitting there maybe 20 minutes when the 2 officers walked in. She clocked them immediately. Not out of paranoia, just habit. 2 men, both in uniform, mid-30s, moving with the particular swagger of people who expected everyone to notice them. The one in front was bigger, broader across the shoulders, with a jaw like a shovel and close-cropped brown hair. His name tag said Pruitt. The one behind him was leaner, younger, with restless eyes that moved around the room taking inventory. They went to the counter first, ordered something, joked with Paulina, who laughed like she was supposed to. Then Pruitt turned and did a slow scan of the room, the way some men do when they want to remind themselves they own the space. His eyes landed on Nora. She looked away, went back to her phone. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. She heard the boots before she saw him. Heavy, deliberate. He was coming to her booth, and she already understood from the pace and weight of his steps that this wasn't going to be a friendly check-in. "You've been here a while," Pruitt said. Nora looked up. "I have coffee." "People are waiting for tables." She looked around the diner. It was maybe half full. 3 empty booths within eye line, 2 more at the back. "There are open seats," she said, keeping her voice flat. "I'm not asking about other seats." He put one hand on the back of her booth and leaned in slightly, establishing the geometry of the thing. He was big, and she was alone, and he was inviting her to feel that. "I'm asking about this one." "I'm a paying customer," Nora said. "I haven't finished my coffee." Something shifted in his expression. He'd expected her to crumble, and she hadn't, and now this was personal. "See, the thing about the Starlight," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make it feel like a private conversation, "is that the owner's a friend of mine. And when the owners got concerns about certain customers, I take that seriously. Nora set her phone down. What concerns? Pruitt shrugged. Loitering, making other customers uncomfortable. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes drinking coffee. That's your version. She looked at him steadily. Is there a specific ordinance I'm in violation of? That landed wrong. She could see it, the language, the specificity. She wasn't playing the game he'd set up, and that was a problem for him. His partner had drifted over now, positioning himself at the end of the booth in a way that was clearly meant to feel like a bracketing maneuver. You want to do this the hard way? Pruitt said. I want to finish my coffee, Nora said. That's all. He straightened, clasped his hands in front of him, smiled, but it didn't touch anything above his mouth. Okay, new approach. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small notepad. Can I get some ID? Nora felt the anger move through her the way it always did. Fast, controlled, and then pressed flat by training and experience. She'd learned a long time ago that anger without discipline was just noise. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her wallet, handed over her driver's license. Pruitt held it, took his time, wrote something down, handed it back. Nora Callahan, nurse, huh? He said it the way some people say, just A. ER, she said. Long shift? 12 hours. He tucked the notepad away. You know what, Ms. Callahan? I'm going to ask you one more time, nicely, to gather your things and leave this establishment. And I'm going to tell you one more time, she said, that I have not violated any law. I am a paying customer, and I have the right to remain here until I've finished. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his radio and spoke quietly into it. She couldn't hear what he said. Paulina appeared from behind the counter with an expression that said she'd seen this before and hated that it kept happening. She paid, Paulina said, keeping her voice low, like she was afraid of the wrong people hearing. She hasn't done anything. Step back, ma'am, Pruitt's partner said. Not loud, just absolute. Paulina stepped back. Nora watched the room. She was counting exits, calibrating distances, reading body language, all of it automatic, all of it invisible. 2 officers, neither in obvious distress, no weapons drawn, situation elevated but not yet critical. She was not going to be the one to escalate. She had learned that lesson the hard way in places that made a diner in Harlow Ridge feel like nothing. This is harassment, she said calmly, and there are cameras in here. She didn't look at the cameras when she said it. She already knew where they were. Pruitt leaned down again, close to her ear this time. See, the thing about cameras, he said quietly, is they only record what I let them record. For the next several minutes, it became a grind. Pruitt stood there. His partner stood there. Nora sat there. The diner stayed quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when everyone present knows something bad might happen and they've already decided not to get involved. She understood why. You don't get involved with police in a neighborhood like this, in a city like Harlow Ridge, where certain people had learned very clearly that getting involved only made things worse for you. She didn't blame the other customers. She'd been a civilian long enough to understand that the calculation people made in those moments wasn't cowardice. It was survival. But she wasn't going to leave. There are things you learn in a combat zone that stay with you in ways you can't fully explain. One of them is the simple foundational fact that there is always a line. You can feel it before you see it. You feel it in the air, in the small muscles of the people around you, in the weight of the silence. Nora had felt that line in places that would have destroyed most people, and she had always known exactly where it was. She felt it now. Pruitt was deciding something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the way his hands dropped to his sides. He was calculating whether to back down or go further, and she already knew which way it was going. Last chance, he said. I know my rights, she said. He grabbed her arm, not a gentle guidance, not a tap. He grabbed her with his full hand around her upper arm and pulled, and the force of it was enough to drag her half out of the booth before she braced. She didn't fight it. She locked her body and let his force meet resistance without giving him anything back, which was its own kind of statement, and he felt that and it made him angrier. Get up, he said, through his teeth now. You're hurting me, she said, loudly and clearly, not panicked, just stated at a volume the whole room could hear. Someone at the counter inhaled sharply. Pruitt yanked harder. She came out of the booth completely, and he shoved her, both hands to her shoulders, and she went back and her hip hit the corner of the neighboring table, and she went down, catching herself on one arm against the seat of the booth. The mug spun off the table and shattered on the floor. The diner went absolutely silent. Nobody moved. Nora pushed herself to her feet slowly. Her hip was going to bruise. She could already feel the ache blooming through it. She straightened, turned to face him, and the look on her face was something Pruitt clearly hadn't expected, because he took one half step back before he caught himself. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even particularly angry, or at least she wasn't wearing it. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something that has already been accounted for. "You just assaulted me," she said. Same volume, same tone. In front of witnesses. "You resisted," Pruitt said. "I did not resist." "You obstructed." "I sat in a booth," she said, "and you put your hands on me." His partner put a hand on Pruitt's arm, said something low. Pruitt shrugged him off. "You want to file a complaint," Pruitt said, stepping toward her. "You go right ahead. Fill out the form. Drop it in the box. See what happens." He paused. "I've been on this force for 11 years. You know what happens to complaints?" She knew what he was going to say. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing happens." Nora picked up her jacket from the floor where it had fallen. She checked her phone. Screen cracked now from the fall. She looked at Paulina behind the counter, who had her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes were wet, and Nora gave her a small nod that said, "This isn't your fault." She was going to walk out. Not because they'd won, not because she was afraid, but because she was doing a calculation of her own. She was calculating what kind of fight this was and what kind of tools it required, and the inside of a diner at 2 a.m. was not the terrain she wanted. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard the sound. It came from the direction of the far end of the counter, a sharp, truncated sound, like something heavy dropping. Then a voice, cracked and urgent. "He's down! Somebody help! He's down!" She turned. An older man, heavy-set, gray-suited, had gone off his stool at the counter and was on the floor. He'd taken a coffee cup with him, and it was rolling in small arcs near his outstretched hand. He was maybe 65, 68. His face was the wrong color. His lips had a bluish cast under the fluorescent light, and his chest was moving in short, uneven rhythms that Nora recognized in the marrow of her bones. She was moving before she'd made a conscious decision to move. "Call 911, she said, loud and clear. "Now. Tell them possible cardiac event, adult male, conscious but deteriorating. Give them this address." She was already at his side, dropping to her knees, 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was there, but it was wrong, was irregular, weak, with gaps that didn't belong. Sir, can you hear me? Open your eyes." His eyes fluttered. "Chest," he managed. "I know. I've got you." She looked up. "I need something to elevate his legs. Backpack, jacket, anything. Somebody get me that first aid kit behind the counter. Now." She was talking with her hands moving, assessing his airway, watching the rise and fall of his chest, timing it. Does he have ID? Has anyone seen this man before? Does anyone know if he's a cardiac patient? Someone handed her a first aid kit. She cracked it open, found it thin but workable. She found aspirin, tore open the package with her teeth, pressed it into his hand. "Can you swallow?" "Sir?" "Small sip of water, and I need you to chew this." His eyes opened properly. They were sharp, not confused, just in pain. He chewed. "Good. Good. Stay with me." She was monitoring his breathing, watching his color, running through a clinical checklist with the automatic ease of someone who'd done this in the back of a field vehicle while someone outside was shooting at them. She found a pulse oximeter in the kit, cheap one but functional, clipped it to his finger. The number that came back made her jaw tighten. "Stay back," she said to the circle forming around her. "Give him air. All of you, step back. I need 3 feet of space and I need quiet." They stepped back. Pruitt was standing at the edge of the crowd. He hadn't moved to help. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "EMS?" she called out. 4 minutes, someone said. 4 minutes was a long time. She kept talking to the man, keeping him conscious, keeping him engaged, regulating his breathing with short verbal cues the way she'd been trained to do. His color was improving slightly. His pulse was evening out. Not good, not safe, but better than it had been 40 seconds ago. "You're going to be okay," she said. "I've got you. What's your name?" "Marcus," he said. "Marcus. Good. Keep talking to me. What were you having for dinner?" "Coffee." "Terrible choice," she said, and he almost smiled. "We're going to have a conversation about that later. Right now I need you to keep your eyes on me. Just me. Nothing else." She heard the door open behind her. Then she heard something else. The crisp, deliberate sound of boots on tile. Not EMS boots. Different. Military cadence, she recognized it without turning around. 3 or 4 people, moving with purpose. And she heard a voice she wasn't expecting. "Clear a path." She didn't look up right away. Marcus was still her priority, and she didn't move her attention until she heard him take a deeper breath, and his numbers ticked up, and the worst-case window had passed. Then she sat back on her heels and turned her head. There were 4 of them inside the diner now, all in civilian clothes but carrying themselves in the way that civilian clothes can't quite cover. They were scanning the room with the systematic efficiency of people trained to read spaces. One of them, a woman, maybe 40, short-cropped hair, with the posture of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any room, had her phone out and was speaking into it in short, clipped sentences. Another one crouched beside the man on the floor. "He's stable," Nora said. "Possible cardiac arrhythmia. EMS is inbound. He needs an AED on standby and a 12 lead as soon as they're on scene. He's been conscious throughout, responded to aspirin. Oxygen sat is still low but trending up." The crouching man looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the man on the floor. "General," he said, "I'm here." Nora went still. The man on the floor, Marcus, opened his eyes more fully and looked at the face beside him with an expression that was equal parts relief and irritation. "Took you long enough," he said, though his voice was thin. "Your detail was outside, sir. We came as fast as—" "She kept me alive," he said, moving his eyes to Nora. "Whatever else happens. She kept me alive." The woman with the phone had stopped speaking into it and was now looking at Nora with the kind of steady, evaluating attention that Nora recognized from a different chapter of her life. She stepped closer, lowered herself slightly to Nora's level. "What unit?" she said. It wasn't a casual question. It was a passkey. Nora met her eyes. "You first." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. "Major Sandra Okafor, Defense Intelligence. The man on the floor is retired General Marcus Webb. He was supposed to be in and out of Harlow Ridge by midnight." She glanced at Pruitt, then back at Nora. "I'm going to need your name." "Nora Callahan." A pause. The major's expression shifted, just slightly, barely readable, but Nora had been trained by experts to read barely readable. "We know that name," Okafor said. Nora didn't respond. The EMS team came through the door. Nora stood, moved back, gave them room, and gave them her report in the efficient, compressed shorthand of someone who'd handed off patients in worse circumstances. The lead paramedic looked at her assessments and didn't argue with a single one of them. Behind her, she heard Okafor talking to her team, heard the words footage, an incident report, and what the hell happened in here? And then she heard Dale Pruitt's voice, changing, losing its certainty, becoming something smaller. "This was a routine welfare check in a diner," Okafor said flatly. "The customer was, well, which customer?" Not a question. Pruitt pointed. At Nora. Okafor turned, looked at Nora again, looked at the cracked phone in Nora's hand, the fresh bruise forming on her forearm, the mug shards still on the floor beside the booth they'd pulled her out of. "Tell me," Okafor said to Pruitt, with the particular calm of someone who already knows the answer, exactly what she did. Pruitt opened his mouth, and every person in the Starlight Diner who had been staring at their plates started looking up. Pruitt opened his mouth, and what came out of it was the beginning of a story that had been carefully constructed, assembled in the few minutes since Okafor and her team walked through the door, shaped in real time from the wreckage of a situation that was no longer going the way he'd planned. "She was being disruptive," he said. We received a complaint from the establishment. From who? Okafor said. The owner. The owner isn't here. Okafor hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. There was a register that people in her line of work developed over years of operating in environments where volume was a liability, and she'd mastered it completely. Every word carrying exactly its weight, no more, no acceleration, no heat. The person behind the counter is an employee named Paulina Reyes. I spoke to her 60 seconds ago. She turned her head slightly without taking her eyes off Pruitt. Thomas. One of her team members, a compact man with graying temples, crossed the diner to where Paulina stood frozen behind the counter, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes moving between Okafor and Pruitt in the manner of someone who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. Ma'am, Thomas said, keeping his voice quiet enough that only Paulina and Nora could hear. Nobody's going to come after you for telling the truth. I need to know, did this establishment request police assistance tonight regarding this customer? He indicated Nora with the slightest tilt of his head. Paulina swallowed, looked at Pruitt once more. Pruitt's expression didn't change, but something in his body language did. A barely perceptible tightening in the shoulders. A stillness that was less composure and more calculation. No, Paulina said, and her voice only broke once, right at the end of the word, right where it mattered most. Nobody called. They just came in. The room received that. The other customers, the ones who'd been pretending their food was the most interesting thing in the world for the last 20 minutes, received it. Even Gus, who'd been standing in the pass-through window with a spatula in his hand and an expression like he was watching a traffic accident, received it. Pruitt's partner, whose name tag said Dellard, shifted his weight in the way people shift when the ground under them starts feeling less reliable. She still resisted a lawful directive, Pruitt said, but the sentence had lost something since the last time he'd used it. The architecture was the same, but the load-bearing walls were gone. Okafor finally looked away from him and looked at Nora directly. Are you injured? Hip, Nora said. And the forearm. I'm fine. You don't have to say you're fine. I know. Nora met her gaze. I'm telling you I'm functional. That's different. Okafor studied her for a moment with that same evaluating attention. EMS is going to want to look at you. EMS has a general to keep alive. I'll wait. There was something that passed between them in that exchange, unspoken, the kind of shorthand that only exists between people who have learned to communicate in situations where there isn't time for full sentences. Okafor gave a single nod and turned back to Pruitt. Officer Pruitt, she said, and the way she said the rank made it sound less like a title and more like a classification. I'm going to need your badge number, your partner's badge number, and both of your body cam footage submitted to my office within the hour. I'm also going to need you to step outside and remain there until I'm finished in here. Pruitt didn't move. You don't have jurisdiction. My office has open cooperative agreements with Harlow Ridge PD, Okafor said. If you'd like, I can call your deputy chief right now and explain the situation. She pulled out her phone and held it up, screen facing him, thumb already positioned. His name is Deputy Chief Raymond Foss. He and I have spoken twice this week. The math happened across Pruitt's face in real time. He was calculating what Okafor knew, what she could do, how far the consequences could reach, whether there was still a version of this night that ended in his favor. The calculation took about 4 seconds. He walked outside. Dellard followed, and nobody in the diner said anything as the bell above the door marked their exit. The EMS team had General Webb on a gurney by then, an oxygen mask in place, leads attached, the lead paramedic rattling off numbers to his partner in the compact, pressured shorthand of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and how little time they have to do it. Webb's color was still not right, pale where it shouldn't have been, with a grayish undertone that Nora recognized as the body conserving its resources. But he was conscious, he was oriented, and twice he'd tried to sit up and twice been firmly told to stop. Nora stood near the door to give them space, watching with the automatic clinical detachment of someone who'd trained that particular emotional separation so deeply it had become structural. She knew she'd done what she could in the window she'd been given. She knew it had been enough. She also knew that enough was not the same as certain, and until she heard numbers she trusted from equipment she trusted, she wasn't going to let herself be sure of anything. Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Can you tell me what you gave him?" "Standard dose aspirin from the kit. I asked before administering. He confirmed no known allergy, no blood thinners, no prior history he was aware of. Pulse was irregular on first contact, weak with variable gaps. Oxygen sat at 79 when I got the oximeter on him, trending up to 84 by the time EMS arrived." Thomas was writing quickly. "Timing? First contact roughly 3 minutes after he went down. His own people were outside. I don't know why. He was supposed to be a low-profile stop." Thomas's voice carried a note of something that wasn't quite frustration but was adjacent to it. "No formal security detail inside. The team was rotating." "That's a gap." "Yes." He wrote something else. "It was." She watched the EMS team wheel Webb toward the door. He turned his head as they passed her, found her face, and held it for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The expression did everything the words would have done. She looked away first because she'd never been comfortable with that part. Okafor took Nora to a booth at the back of the diner, not the one she'd been sitting in originally, which still had coffee on the seat from the fallen mug. Okafor sat across from her with the posture of someone who was very good at making official conversations feel informal, which was its own skill, and Nora was aware of it without resenting it. "How long were you in?" Okafor asked. 6 years? "Unit?" Nora looked at her. "Does that need to go in your report?" "It would help fill in some blanks." "What blanks need filling?" Okafor set her pen down. "Look, I'm going to be direct with you. I know who you are. I don't mean personally. I mean your file crossed my desk 8 months ago when we were doing a personnel review on former assets. Combat medical specialist, advanced trauma qualification, embedded with Task Unit 7 for the last 3 of your 6 years. She paused. "You held rank of Sergeant First Class when you separated." Nora said nothing. "You received the Distinguished Service Cross for an action in a classified operational theater 2 years before you left." Okafor said it the way she'd say anything factual, not with weight, not to impress, just as data. "The citation is still sealed. Then you shouldn't be saying it out loud in a diner. The diner is secure." Okafor glanced briefly toward Thomas, who was standing near the entrance with his arms crossed, facing outward. "Why did you leave?" It was the kind of question that was easy to answer badly. Nora had answered it in 12 different ways over 3 years and had yet to find one that felt honest without feeling like too much. She went with the version that was shortest and truest. "I'd given what I had to give. It was time." Okafor nodded slowly. "And now you work ER at Delmore General, night shifts. You like it?" Nora looked at her. "I'm good at it." "That's not the same as liking it." "No," Nora agreed. "It's not." Okafor was quiet for a moment, turning her pen over in her fingers. Outside, through the window, Nora could see Pruitt and Dellard standing on the sidewalk. Pruitt had his phone to his ear. The call had been going for a while. "What I'm about to tell you," Okafor said, "isn't in any report yet. Some of it may never be, depending on how the next 72 hours go." She set the pen flat on the table. "General Webb wasn't in Harlow Ridge by accident. He was here because we have a developing situation involving this city's law enforcement and a real estate development consortium with about 6 shell companies between it and its actual principals. It's been building for 18 months, she paused. The name Creighton Development Group mean anything to you? Nora shook her head. It will. Okafor picked up the pen again. Someone inside HRPD has been clearing the way for them, targeting specific districts, predominantly older residents, veterans, nurses, low-income families, with exactly the kind of low-level harassment and intimidation that doesn't trip any single legal wire, but when you map it over 18 months, draws a very clear picture. Nora looked at Pruitt through the window. He was still on the phone. And Pruitt is part of it, she said. Not a question. He's not the top of it. Okafor folded her hands. But yes. The thing about that information was that it didn't surprise her. That was almost worse than if it had. The surprise would have meant she still believed in a version of things that she'd apparently stopped believing in some time ago without fully registering it. Instead, what she felt was a kind of cold, precise clarity, The same feeling she'd had on operations when the intelligence confirmed what she'd already suspected from the terrain. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Okafor looked at her steadily. "Right now?" "Your count. Everything from the moment you walked in tonight." She opened a fresh page in the notebook. "All of it. In sequence. Don't editorialize, don't interpret. Just tell me what happened." Nora told her. It took 11 minutes. She gave it clean. Times, positions, exact words, exact sequence of events. The shove. The fall. The mug. The moment she chose to walk out and the sound that stopped her. Okafor wrote steadily and didn't interrupt except once, to ask Nora to repeat the exact words Pruitt had said about the cameras. When Nora finished, Okafor put the cap back on her pen. "You said he told you the cameras only record what he lets them record. Word for word. He said that to you out loud, in a diner full of people." He said it quietly, but yes. Okafor exhaled through her nose. It was not quite the sound of disbelief and not quite the sound of confirmation. It was the sound of someone who'd been building a case for 18 months and had just been handed a piece that fit a space she'd been staring at for 6 of them. "Okay," she said, "I need you to write that down in a formal statement." She slid a pre-printed form across the table, the kind she'd clearly come prepared to use, which meant she'd come to Harlow Ridge tonight expecting the situation to produce paperwork. "Take your time. If you need water, ask Thomas." Nora pulled the form toward her, looked at it. "What happens to Webb?" "He'll be at Voss Memorial within 20 minutes. Cardiology team is already on standby." Okafor stood. "He's going to be all right, Sergeant." It was the first time she'd used the rank. Nora didn't correct her. She was halfway through the statement when the door opened and a man came in who had not been there before. Middle 40s, good coat, that particular kind of tan that comes from being outdoors on purpose rather than by accident. He carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone who was used to being the most important person in whatever room he entered, and he looked around the diner with the expression of a man assessing damage. Thomas moved to intercept him before he'd taken 3 steps. "Sir, I'm looking for Major Okafor." His voice was smooth, practiced, designed to convey reasonableness even when the situation didn't warrant it. "I'm Stuart Fain. I represent Harlow Ridge PD. I was told there was an incident." "There was," Thomas said. "You can wait outside." "I think I'd rather—" "That wasn't a suggestion." Stuart Fain looked at Thomas with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked across the diner and found Nora, sitting with the form in front of her, pen in hand, watching him. Something passed through his face, quick, controlled, and Nora read it clearly. He knew who she was, not from tonight. He'd seen her name somewhere before tonight, or been briefed about her, or both. She was certain of it in the same way she'd been certain about certain things in the field. Not evidence yet, but the kind of pattern recognition that had kept her alive long enough to become a nurse. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the form and kept writing. She heard him say something to Thomas, quieter, more careful this time. And then she heard the door again, and when she looked up, Fain was on the sidewalk outside and he was talking to Pruitt, and the way they were talking was not the way a police department's legal representative talks to an officer he's meeting for the first time. They knew each other, well enough to talk without the formal buffering that people use when they're performing professionalism. Nora wrote that in the margins of her statement. Small, precise, time-stamped. Okafor came back to the table 20 minutes later. She picked up the statement, read it quickly, stopped at the margins, looked at Nora. "You clocked Fain. He recognized me. You're sure?" "I'm sure." Okafor read the marginal notes again. Then she folded the statement and put it in her coat pocket. Fain's firm represents Creighton Development Group, among other clients. She said it without emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. His being here tonight is either a coincidence or a response. How fast did he get here? Okafor checked her watch. Incident started around 2:15. Fain walked in at 2:51. That's not a response time, Nora said. That's someone who was already in the neighborhood. Okafor sat down. This time she didn't open her notebook. She just looked at Nora across the table with the expression of a person reassessing something. You said you do night shifts. Usually. What time does your next shift start? Nora glanced at her cracked phone. I'm off until Thursday. Good. Okafor folded her hands. I want you to go home, get some sleep, and tomorrow morning I want you to meet me at the Federal Building on Canal Street, 9 o'clock. She slid a card across the table. Come in through the side entrance, not the main lobby. Bring any documentation you have regarding tonight, including your medical records if you need treatment for those injuries. She looked at Nora's forearm. Get them looked at. I told you. I know what you told me. Okafor stood. Get them looked at anyway. Nora took the card. What happens at 9 o'clock? You give a full recorded statement. We establish you as a witness of record. Okafor paused. And we talk about the last 18 months. Specifically, whether you've encountered any other situations at Delmore General or in the surrounding district that resembled tonight. The harassment pattern we've been tracking includes hospitals. Nora looked at her. You think they've been running it into the medical system? I think, Okafor said carefully, that I'd like to hear what you've seen, but She got home at 4:15. The apartment was on the third floor of a building on Leicester Street, 10 minutes from the hospital, chosen specifically because it had a fire escape she could reach from the bedroom window and a superintendent who asked no questions. She'd lived there for 2 years and had never once felt fully settled in it, which she'd stopped treating as a problem and started treating as a preference. She sat on the edge of the bed with her jacket still on and looked at the bruise on her forearm for a while. It was coming in purple-yellow, wider than she'd estimated. The fluorescent light in the diner had undersold it. Her hip was worse, a deep contusion that was going to make the next 3 days uncomfortable in a way that was manageable but relentless. She thought about writing down what she remembered about Fane, the exact expression on his face, the specific way he'd looked at her. While it was still sharp, but she was tired in the way that only certain kinds of nights produce, the kind of tired where the body isn't the issue and the mind won't stop being the issue. She'd kept someone alive tonight. That was real. That was always the anchor she came back to when other things became unmanageable. She'd kept Marcus Webb alive on the floor of a diner with a cheap first aid kit and a set of skills that nobody in that diner had known she possessed, and he was at a hospital right now being taken care of by a cardiology team, and that was a fixed, unalterable fact. She held on to it. She didn't sleep so much as fall through the next few hours, surfacing once around 6 when a bus braked loudly outside, and then again at 7:40 when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Harlow Ridge area code. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, Ms. Callahan? A man's voice, not Pruitt. Older, more controlled, with the deliberate cadence of someone who'd spent time in rooms where every word was being weighed. My name isn't important. What's important is that we're aware of the statement you gave tonight, and we'd like the opportunity to discuss the situation before it goes further. Nora sat up. She was already fully awake, the way she always went from asleep to functional. No gradient, just a switch. Who's we? People who have an interest in making sure tonight's misunderstanding doesn't get misrepresented. Misrepresentation, she said, is that what concerns you? There are always multiple ways to describe the same events. The version that gets put into official records shapes things in ways that can be difficult to undo. A pause. I think you're a reasonable person. I think you understand that sometimes it's better to resolve things quietly. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on the fire escape railing and immediately left. Let me make sure I understand, she said. You're calling me at 7:40 in the morning. You won't give me your name. And you want me to think carefully about my statement. She let the sentence sit. Do I have that right? I'm simply suggesting there's more flexibility in this situation than you might think. I see. She looked at the card on her nightstand. Canal Street, 9 o'clock, side entrance. I appreciate the call, she said. Have a good morning. She hung up and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she got up, went to the bathroom, and ran cold water over her face until she felt completely present. She looked at herself in the mirror. The bruise on her forearm visible in her peripheral vision, hair pressed flat on one side, the slight tightness around her eyes that she recognized as the face she wore when she was making herself hold still. She was not afraid. That was the first thing she checked, because fear was useful, and she'd learned to treat it as information rather than interference. What she felt instead was something sharper and more directed than fear. The same thing she'd felt on the floor of that diner when Pruitt's hands had landed on her and she'd made the decision not to escalate. She'd been measured then. She was going to be measured now. But measured did not mean passive. Measured did not mean quiet. And the people who were calling her at 7:40 in the morning to suggest that her memory was flexible had made a mistake common to people who'd spent too long operating without consequence. They had looked at someone who chose not to fight back in a diner and concluded that she couldn't. She thought about Paulina saying no, nobody called, in a voice that cracked at the end. She thought about the other customers who'd stared at their plates. She thought about the man on the phone who didn't have a name, who had connections to whatever Creighton Development Group was and whatever it had been doing in this city for 18 months, and who had gotten her number, her personal number, her real one, the one that wasn't listed, before 8 o'clock in the morning. She got dressed, ate the half of a protein bar she found in her jacket pocket, and left the apartment at 8:15. She was at the Federal Building on Canal Street with 12 minutes to spare. The side entrance put her in a corridor that smelled like floor cleaner and recycled air, industrial gray walls with motivational signage that nobody had bothered to update since the early 2000s. A young man with a security badge met her, checked her ID without conversation, and walked her to a conference room on the 4th floor that looked out over the parking structure. Okafor was already there. So were 2 other people she hadn't met. A man in his 50s with the build of someone who'd been in the military a long time and the eyes of someone still in it, introduced simply as Hargrove, and a woman about Nora's age with a laptop open and a recording device on the table already running, introduced as Specialist Dunn. "You got a call this morning," Okafor said. She wasn't asking. Nora sat down. "How did you know?" "We've been monitoring certain communication channels since last night. The number that called you is a prepaid registered to a shell company." Okafor turned her laptop to face Nora, showing a map of Harlow Ridge with several points marked in red. 9 of those points are locations where witnesses or complainants in our investigation received contact prior to formal statements. 7 of them withdrew or modified what they were going to say. Nora looked at the map. "What happened to the other 2? One moved out of state. One is still considering." Nora looked up. "That's the pattern." "That's the pattern," Hargrove confirmed. His voice was the kind that expected to be listened to without needing to perform the expectation. "They don't threaten. They suggest. They imply flexibility. They make it sound like there are options that don't exist, or they make the existing options sound worse than they are. Most people don't have the background to evaluate whether what they're being told is actually accurate, so they default to the version that seems less dangerous." He looked at her directly. "You didn't." "I've been lied to by better people than whoever called me this morning," Nora said. Something moved in Hargrove's expression that might have been appreciation. "All right," Okafor said, opening a fresh folder. "Let's start from the beginning." The formal statement took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Nora gave it the way she'd been trained to give field reports. Linear, specific, unembellished, with timestamps and positioning data where she had them. Dunn typed and occasionally stopped her for spelling or clarification. Hargrove asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them pointing at the same thing: the moment Fain walked in, what she'd read in his face, and the exact words from the phone call. When it was done, Okafor leaned back. "The bruise on your forearm. We're going to need medical documentation. I can go to Delmore General this afternoon." "Not Delmore." Okafor pushed a paper across the table with an address on it. "Go here. The physician there knows what she's doing, and she's documented cases for us before. She'll give you a full assessment." Nora took the paper. "Can I ask how Webb is?" "Stable," Hargrove said. "Arrhythmia, not a full cardiac event. The aspirin almost certainly bought the window EMS needed." He paused. "He's asking about you." "He doesn't need to." "He's a general," Hargrove said. "When a general asks about someone, it's not really a matter of need." Tick. She left the Federal Building at noon and spent the next 2 hours at the address on Okafor's paper, being examined by a doctor named Vela, who moved with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd done this work before and understood what it was for. She documented everything: the forearm, the hip, the smaller abrasions from the fall, in clinical language that was designed to survive a courtroom. She photographed everything. She gave Nora copies. "You said this happened at 2:15 in the morning," Dr. Vela said, making a note. "Around then." "The bruising pattern is consistent with that timeline." She set down her pen. "You should have come in last night." "I was busy." "Doing what?" "Keeping someone alive." Dr. Vela looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding not to ask the follow-up question. "Take ibuprofen for the hip. Nothing more strenuous than walking for the next 3 days." She handed over the documentation folder. "For what it's worth, this is thorough. If this goes where it sounds like it's going, it'll matter." Nora thanked her and walked out into the afternoon light. Harlow Ridge looked ordinary. It always did. Medium-height buildings, a river that the city kept promising to develop the banks of, coffee shops and pharmacies and parking garages, and all the usual infrastructure of a place where 60-some thousand people had built their lives. From a certain angle, in certain light, it was even kind of beautiful, in the unspectacular way of places that hadn't tried too hard, and therefore hadn't failed too hard. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about the map in the conference room. 9 points. 7 people who'd quietly stepped back from what they knew. She thought about the voice on the phone, smooth and unnamed, already moving before the ink on her statement was dry. She thought about Pruitt standing outside the Starlight Diner last night on his phone, and Fane on the sidewalk beside him with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. She thought about 18 months of systematic harassment, veterans and nurses and seniors pushed out of neighborhoods quietly, without any single incident big enough to make headlines, the whole operation running below the threshold of public attention because it had been designed that way by someone who understood exactly where that threshold was. And then she thought about something Okafor had said in passing, in the conference room, while she was looking at the map. She'd said it like it was incidental, like it was just geography, but Nora had filed it without reacting because she'd learned not to react until she knew what she was reacting to. Okafor had said that 6 of the 9 contact points were in the district that included Delmore General's residential catchment area. Her hospital. Her patients. The people she'd been treating for 3 years, who lived in apartments like hers, on streets like this one. She pulled out the cracked phone and dialed. Okafor picked up on the second ring. "Delmore General is in the affected district," Nora said. "You said you wanted to know what I'd seen over the last 18 months. I need to make you a list." A pause. "How long a list?" Nora thought about 3 years of night shifts. 3 years of patients who came in with injuries that didn't quite map to the stories attached to them, or who asked careful questions about confidentiality before they said anything about what had happened, or who stopped coming in at all, stopped appearing in her system, addresses changed to somewhere across the state line, or just changed to nothing. "Longer than you're expecting," she said. The silence on the other end was brief, but weighted in a way that told her something. "Come back in," Okafor said. She was halfway down Canal Street when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, no greeting, just a photograph. She stopped on the sidewalk and opened it. It was her, standing outside the Federal Building, taken from across the street, from an elevation, 2nd or 3rd floor of the building opposite, with a camera that had a long enough lens to frame only her face and shoulders, sharp enough to see the bruise on her forearm. Taken, based on the angle of the light, approximately 40 minutes ago. She stood there for a moment, the cracked phone in her hand, the photograph open on the screen. Then she took a screenshot of the text, the number, and the timestamp. She crossed the street and went back into the Federal Building, through the side entrance, up to the 4th floor, and put the phone on the table in front of Okafor without a word. Okafor looked at the screen, then she looked at Nora. Then she picked up her own phone and made a call that Nora couldn't quite hear, speaking quietly and with a specific kind of urgency that she recognized from the field. Not panic, not alarm, but the sharp, compressed energy of someone who has just understood that the timeline has changed. Whatever they'd been building toward in those 18 months of investigation had just shifted. The people on the other side knew she was inside this building. They knew she was talking, and they wanted her to know that they knew, which meant they were either very confident or they were scared. In Nora's experience, those two things often looked identical right up until the moment they didn't. Okafor made 3 calls in the next 8 minutes, and Nora sat in the corner of the conference room and watched her work. The first call was short, 40 seconds, names and numbers exchanged, a specific address requested. The second was longer, and Okafor's voice dropped into a register Nora couldn't fully hear, though she caught fragments. Surveillance asset, federal building exterior, pull the footage from the last 2 hours. The third call she stepped out of the room to make entirely. Hargrove stayed. He looked at the screenshot on Nora's phone, then set it down with the careful precision of a man who didn't want to give anything away with his hands. "This is the 4th time they've done something like this," he said. 2 of those 4 times, the witness left town within a week. "I'm not leaving town," Nora said. He looked at her. "I know." He said it like it wasn't reassurance, just assessment. "That's what concerns me." She understood what he meant. The photograph wasn't a threat in any legal sense. It was a message, designed to be deniable, designed to function in the gap between what could be proven and what could be felt. The people behind this had done it before, and they were good at calibrating exactly how much pressure to apply without creating the kind of evidence that could be used against them. They'd built an entire operation on that calibration, but they'd made a mistake last night, maybe more than one. Okafor came back in and sat down, and this time she brought a tablet with her, which she turned to face Nora. On the screen was a map of Harlow Ridge with a new layer added, a grid overlay in blue, marking property parcels, with a subset of them highlighted in red. "Creighton Development Group's acquisition targets," she said, "over the last 22 months. She let Nora look. The hospital catchment area is in the center of it. The red parcels made a shape that wasn't random. Nora had looked at enough terrain maps to recognize intentional geometry when she saw it. Someone had designed this, not grabbed at what was available, but chosen a specific footprint in the city and worked toward it methodically, parcel by parcel, quarter by quarter. "They're trying to build something," she said. "A mixed-use development corridor," Hargrove said. "We have the planning documents. A contact inside the city zoning office pulled them 6 weeks ago." He paused. "They project a $400 million valuation at completion." Nora looked at the red parcels again. The streets they covered were the streets she drove to work. The zip codes were where her patients lived. Some of the marked lots had addresses she recognized from admission forms, from the intake notes she'd written in the small hours of 100 different nights. "How far along are they?" she asked. 42% of target parcels already acquired or under contract. Okafor moved her finger across the map. The remaining 58% are occupied, mostly long-term residents, some small businesses, 2 community health facilities. She looked up. One of the health facilities is a veterans outreach clinic on Norwood Avenue. Nora had referred patients there. She had walked 3 people through the intake process herself, driven one of them in her own car because the bus route had been cut. "How are they getting people out?" she asked, though she already partly knew. "Code enforcement complaints that appear out of nowhere and disappear once a property sells. Water service interruptions with paperwork delays that stretch for months. Zoning challenges that make it impossible to operate a business while the challenge is pending." Hargrove ticked them off without emphasis, which made them worse somehow. The flatness of it, the bureaucratic ordinariness. And officers like Pruitt, who create enough low-level intimidation in targeted areas that people stop feeling safe. Not safe enough to call it violence, just not safe. Nora thought about the 7 people who'd walked back from their statements. She thought about the voice on the phone that morning, smooth and reasonable, talking about flexibility and multiple perspectives. "Who's at the top?" she said. Okafor and Hargrove looked at each other for a half-second too long. "That's what we haven't been able to fully establish," Okafor said. "Creighton Development Group has 4 named principals, 3 of whom are investors with no operational role. The 4th is a man named Victor Aldrin. He controls the holding company that controls Creighton. Getting to him through the corporate structure requires going through 7 layers of subsidiaries across 3 states. She closed the map. "What we have is the bottom layer and the middle layer, Pruitt, Fain. Several other officers we've been watching. A city council member who's been expediting permits." She paused. "What we don't have yet is the chain of evidence that connects all of it to Aldrin in a way that survives a federal prosecution." "Until last night," Nora said. "Until last night," Okafor agreed. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the parking structure sat gray and mid-morning in the November light. "The photograph they sent you," Okafor said. "We're treating it as an attempt to intimidate a federal witness. That changes our timeline." "How?" "It means they're escalating instead of contracting." She folded her hands. "They could have gone quiet. Let us build the case at our pace, kept their exposure minimal. Instead, they took a surveillance photo of you entering a federal building and sent it to your phone within 40 minutes. That's not the behavior of a carefully managed operation." She looked at Nora. "Something spooked them." "Webb," Hargrove said. It wasn't a question. "He wasn't supposed to be part of this." Okafor turned her tablet face down. "When a 4-star general ends up in an ER over an incident connected to your operation, the visibility changes. People above Aldrin start asking questions. The timeline gets compressed whether you want it to or not." Nora was quiet, thinking. "You said Webb is asking about me." "He is." "Can I talk to him?" PM. Voss Memorial was 12 minutes from the federal building in light traffic, and the cardiology floor sat on the 6th level with a view of the river that Webb almost certainly hadn't looked at yet, because he was lying flat in a monitoring bed with leads on his chest and an IV in his arm and the expression of a man who had not made peace with being horizontal. He looked better than he had on the floor of the Starlight Diner. That was a low bar, but the color in his face had returned to something that resembled its natural range, and his eyes were sharp in the way that some people's eyes stay sharp, regardless of what the rest of them is doing. He looked at her when she came in and said, "You're shorter than I remembered." "You were on the floor," she said. "Everything's taller from the floor." He almost smiled. She pulled up the chair beside the bed and sat. And for a moment they just looked at each other in the way that people do when they've shared an extreme situation and are still processing what it means that they're both on the other side of it. "Arrhythmia," he said. "They're telling me it may have been developing for months." "Could be." She looked at the monitor above him. His rhythm was regular now, corrected by medication and rest. "Sometimes it takes a physical stressor to make it visible." "Have you been sleeping?" "Generals don't sleep." "Generals have cardiac events in diners." He absorbed that. "Fair point." He shifted slightly in the bed, and she could see the careful way he managed the discomfort, the small economy of movement of a person who didn't want to show how much something hurt. "Okafor told me what happened after I went down." Okafor talks a lot for someone in intelligence. She talks exactly as much as she needs to, and not one word more. "So does that mean what she told me is accurate?" "Probably." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling. "You had 6 years, Task Unit 7. Last posting was in the Kandesh corridor." She didn't respond to that. "I'm not asking for confirmation," he said. I'm giving you context. I know what that posting required. I know what kind of people they attach to those units." He turned his head to look at her. "You've been working ER night shifts for 3 years. I like the work." "I'm sure you do." He folded his hands on the blanket over his chest. "How bad is Harlow Ridge?" She considered how to answer. "Bad in the way things are bad when they've been allowed to develop slowly enough that nobody noticed until it was already structured." He understood that. She could see it. "What do you need?" "Okafor needs the chain to Aldrin." "I know what Okafor needs. I'm asking what you need." She hadn't been asked that version of the question, and for a second she didn't know what to do with it. She looked at the window. The river, flat and gray below, the far bank where the older part of the city sat in its ordinary morning, and she tried to find an honest answer. "I need Pruitt in a room where what he did last night has consequences," she said. "Not managed consequences. Real ones." She paused. "And I need to know the people he was working for can't just find the next Pruitt and start over." Webb looked at her steadily. "That's not a small ask." "I know. It means the case has to go all the way up." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. The monitor above him beeped at its regular interval, indifferent to the conversation. "I have a meeting scheduled with the Deputy Director of the DOJ Integrity Division next week. It was already on the calendar, routine oversight review. It becomes less routine if I walk in with a complete evidentiary package on a law enforcement corruption network operating in tandem with a federal-scale real estate fraud." Nora looked at him. "How complete?" Complete enough to prosecute. Not just investigate. Prosecute. He said it with a precision that told her he'd been thinking about this for longer than the last 12 hours. I need 3 things. The financial connection between HRPD command structure and Creighton's shell companies. The communication records between Fain and Pruitt going back at least 12 months. And a credible witness who can put the operational harassment on the record in a way that survives cross-examination. He looked at her when he said the third one. I already gave a recorded statement, she said. I know, it's a start. He shifted again in the bed. Nora, the people who sent you that photograph this morning, they're going to come at this harder before they pull back. When an operation like this feels the walls closing, the instinct is to discredit the most dangerous piece of evidence first. He paused. You are currently the most dangerous piece of evidence. She already knew that. She'd known it since the parking lot outside the federal building. What are they going to try? She said. Employment record, personal history, anything that can be surfaced to make you look unstable or unreliable before your testimony reaches anyone who matters. He turned his head toward her fully. Is there anything they can find? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about it. Not defensively, just clearly. She thought about the year after she got out, when she'd been raw in ways she hadn't had language for yet, when she'd made 2 or 3 decisions she wouldn't make now. She thought about the medical board complaint from a physician at Delmore who hadn't liked how she'd managed a trauma case, a complaint that had been reviewed and dismissed but was still in her file. There's a dismissed complaint, she said. 18 months old. Attending named Greer didn't like a call I made in the ER. Patient survived. Complaint was found to be without merit. Webb's expression didn't change. Can Greer be reached? Greer has since moved to a hospital in another city, but I don't know his relationship to... Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Okafor. She answered. We pulled the footage from the building across Canal Street, Okafor said, and her voice had shifted, not louder but tighter, the way voices get when what's in them is trying to be managed. The camera on the 2nd floor belongs to an insurance office. They gave us access. And? The man who took that photograph is identified. We ran him. A pause. He's a former Harlow Ridge PD officer, resigned 14 months ago. Name is Brett Salas. Another pause, shorter. Nora, Salas resigned the same week we have documented evidence of the first witness withdrawal in our case. She looked at Webb. He was watching her face. Where is Salas now? She asked. That's the issue. Okafor's voice went very steady in the way that voices go when the news is bad enough that steadiness becomes a discipline. We put a flag on his vehicle registration 40 minutes ago. Patrol unit spotted the car 20 minutes ago. Where? Leicester Street, Okafor said. Parked outside your building. The room went still around her. Webb's monitor kept its rhythm. The river outside kept its flat gray course. Somewhere down the hall, a cart moved over linoleum with a sound like a long exhale. Nora was already standing. Stay where you are, Okafor said. Do not go back to Leicester Street. I have a unit 2 minutes out. He's just watching, Nora said, though she wasn't sure of that. He was just taking a photograph too. Okafor's voice carried no room for negotiation. Stay at Voss Memorial. I'll call you when we have him. She lowered the phone. Webb was watching her with the expression of a man who had read the situation from one side of a conversation and understood it accurately. Salas? He said. Outside my apartment. He reached for the call button beside his bed, not the nurse call. The other one, the secure line that she hadn't noticed until now, which told her something about the level of preparation that had gone into his presence in Harlow Ridge. He spoke into it briefly, 3 sentences, and set it down. I have 2 people in this building, he said. They'll stay with you until Okafor's unit makes contact. I don't need Nora. He said her name with the particular weight of someone who was not going to argue but was not going to move either. Let people help you. It's not a character flaw. She sat back down. Not because she was afraid, though she wasn't pretending the situation was neutral. A man who'd spent 14 months systematically dismantling witnesses to a federal corruption case was parked outside her home, and that was a fact she was holding with both hands. She sat down because Webb was right. and because she'd learned the hard way in a different context that the impulse to handle everything alone was sometimes discipline and sometimes just ego dressed up as discipline. She looked at his monitor. Regular, steady. "The complaint in my file," she said. "The one from Greer. I'll have it reviewed." He said it simply, like it was already done. I'm not asking you to protect me from it. I'm saying if they go after it, I want to be the one who addresses it. On record. My account. My terms." He looked at her for a moment. "All right? Because if they manage to make this about my credibility, everything else goes with it. The diner. The photograph. The list I was building for Okafor about the hospital district." She kept her voice level. "And then everything those 7 people were too scared to say stays unsaid." Webb held her gaze. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully categorize. Not pity, nothing so diminishing. More like recognition, the kind that comes from having spent a long time around people who understand exactly what's at stake and are choosing to be present anyway. "I know," he said. "That's why you're the most important piece of this." Her phone rang again. Okafor. "Salas is in custody," she said. He did not resist. He had a camera with a long lens, a prepaid phone, and a notebook with your schedule in it. A pause. "Your work schedule. Your shift rotations at Delmore General." Nora processed that. "Who gave it to him?" "We don't know yet, but Delmore's administrative system was accessed 3 days ago using credentials belonging to a charge nurse who was on leave." Another pause, more weighted than the last. "The access point was an IP address registered to a property management company that is a subsidiary of Creighton Development Group." The shape of it became fully clear then. Not new information exactly, but the existing information clicking into a configuration that was complete. They hadn't just been watching her since last night. They'd been watching her, or preparing to watch her, before the diner, before Pruitt, before any of it had become visible. Which meant either Nora had been on their radar for reasons unconnected to last night, or "Okafor," she said. "Was General Webb's visit to Harlow Ridge known to anyone inside HRPD before last night?" A silence that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. "We are currently asking that question," Okafor said. She spent the next 4 hours in a secured conference room 2 floors above Webb's room, with a DOJ analyst named Prescott, who had the energy of someone who hadn't slept properly in days, and the focus of someone who'd stopped noticing. He walked her through the Delmore access logs line by line, and she walked him through what she knew about the hospital's administrative structure. Who had access to what, which systems were siloed, and which weren't. It was detailed, granular work, the kind that looked like nothing from the outside and was actually everything. She'd done versions of it in the field, not with spreadsheets, but with maps and personnel files and the particular discipline of moving through information without letting impatience make you skip steps. She didn't skip steps. By 2 in the afternoon, they had identified 4 separate access events over the preceding 6 weeks, all using the same borrowed credentials, all originating from IP addresses that traced back through the same chain of shell companies. Each access had pulled a different category of data: scheduling, patient census numbers by district zip code, emergency contact records for admitted patients, and, on the most recent occasion, internal incident reports filed by nursing staff. "Why incident reports?" Prescott said, half to himself. Nora looked at the log. "Because I filed 3 of them in the last 8 months. Patient complaints about housing intimidation, residents who came in for one thing and mentioned, while they were talking, that they'd been having trouble with code enforcement or property management pressure." She looked at Prescott. "I documented them because I thought it was a pattern. I flagged them to hospital administration." "What did administration do?" She looked at him steadily. "Nothing." He wrote something down. She watched his pen move and thought about the 8 months she'd spent believing that the proper channel would eventually respond, that the flags she'd raised would reach someone who could act on them. She had not, she realized now, been wrong to try. She'd been wrong to assume that the absence of a response meant the flags hadn't been read. "Who in administration received those flags?" Prescott asked. "Facilities Liaison for Patient Welfare. Name is Donna Arroyo." She paused. "And the Deputy Director of Hospital Operations. Name is Kurt Selig. Prescott's pen stopped. Selig, he said, not loud, just with a particular quality of attention that told her the name had registered somewhere it had already been. You know that name, she said. Kurt Selig sits on the board of a community development nonprofit that received a $200,000 grant from a Creighton subsidiary 18 months ago. He said it the way people say things when the words themselves are the revelation and nothing else is needed. He's been in our peripheral vision. We couldn't establish a direct operational connection. Nora sat with that for a moment. 3 years of night shifts, 3 years of working under a deputy director who had been receiving money from the same organization that was systematically dismantling the community her patients came from, who had read her flags and done nothing, who had done nothing because doing nothing was exactly what he'd been positioned to do. She thought about the faces of the patients who'd mentioned housing trouble in passing. The veteran on Norwood who'd come in with chest pain and mentioned almost apologetically that his landlord had been sending letters he didn't understand. The retired schoolteacher who'd been admitted for a fall and whose daughter had called 3 days later to say they were moving because the building had been condemned on a code violation that had appeared from nowhere. The anger that moved through her then was different from what she'd felt in the diner. Colder. More specific. It didn't need anywhere to go. It just needed to be used. Tell Okafor about Selig, she said, and pull his communication records with Arroyo going back 18 months. If he was forwarding my incident reports to Creighton's people, there'll be a chain. Prescott was already dialing. By evening, the thing had weight. Okafor briefed her at 6 o'clock in the same conference room, standing at the head of the table with her jacket still on and the expression of someone who had been moving fast all day and had not yet decided whether to feel anything about where they'd arrived. The financial connection Webb had described that morning, the chain between HRPD's command structure and Creighton's shell companies, had been partially established through records subpoenaed from 3 banks over the course of the afternoon. The numbers weren't final, but the pattern was clear enough. A series of consulting payments routed through 2 LLCs to a third company whose sole registered agent was the brother-in-law of HRPD's deputy chief, Raymond Foss. The same Raymond Foss whose name Okafor had mentioned to Pruitt in the Starlight Diner to end the conversation. The communication records between Fain and Pruitt, which Webb had listed as a requirement, had been obtained via warrant from Fain's firm's server provider. They went back 16 months. They were, in Okafor's words, explicit enough to make Fain's defense attorney's job genuinely difficult. And Selig's forwarding chain had been found in less than 3 hours. 14 emails over 8 months, each one containing the text of one of Nora's incident reports, sent to an address belonging to Fain's firm with a subject line that read, each time, FYI. Internal, low priority. 14 times. He had read her flags and quietly handed them to the people she was flagging. When do you move? Nora asked. Webb is briefing the DOJ deputy director tomorrow morning by secure video. Okafor sat down for the first time since Nora had come back in. She looked briefly like a person who was tired. We're targeting coordinated arrests for Thursday. Federal warrants for Fain, Selig, and 3 of the Creighton principals. HRPD Internal Affairs, operating under DOJ oversight, will handle Pruitt, Dellard, and Foss simultaneously. Simultaneously, Nora said, so nobody has time to call anyone else before they're in a room. Nora thought about the logistics of that, the planning required, the coordination, the number of things that had to hold for 2 more days without leaking. What's the exposure between now and Thursday? That's what I want to talk to you about. Okafor folded her hands on the table. You are still the most visible piece of this. Salas is in custody, and that removes one vector, but the people above him know he's been picked up, and they know what that means for their timeline. She looked at Nora directly. I'd like you to not go home tonight. They already know where I work, which is why I'd also like you to call in for your next shift. Nora looked at her. You want me to disappear for 2 days? Well, I want you to be somewhere that isn't predictable. Okafor's voice was even. I know what I'm asking. I know it's not comfortable, but you are not just a witness anymore. You are the witness whose statement, combined with Webb's testimony and the financial records, makes this case federal and makes it stick. If they find a way to put you in a position where your credibility is compromised or where something happens to you, we lose the through line. The room was quiet. The river through the window was dark now, just the lights from the far bank reflecting in it. Where? Nora said. We have a safe location. It's not a cell, it's an apartment. You'll have your phone, access to everything you need. She paused. 2 days, Nora. Thursday morning, this moves, and you walk out of it on the other side. Nora thought about her apartment on Leicester Street, the fire escape, the superintendent who asked no questions. She thought about the schedule in Salas's notebook, her schedule, her shift rotations, obtained by people who'd accessed the hospital's system using stolen credentials, which meant they'd been building infrastructure around her movement before she'd ever sat down in the Starlight Diner. She thought about the 14 emails. Selig reading her flags and writing FYI, low priority in the subject line, sending them along to the people she was trying to stop. Okay, she said. The apartment Okafor's team used was on the 8th floor of a building on the east side, anonymous and clean, with windows that faced a courtyard rather than the street. Thomas brought her a bag, change of clothes, toiletries, a laptop with a VPN already configured. She didn't ask how they'd gotten into her apartment to pack it. She was choosing her battles. She spent the first evening building the list she'd promised Okafor, the full accounting of what she'd seen at Delmore General over 3 years. It was longer than she'd estimated and more specific than she'd feared. 23 patients over 30 months whose housing situations had appeared in their clinical notes, flagged by her or by other nursing staff, charted under social determinants of health in the way that hospitals were supposed to but rarely did consistently. 11 of those patients had follow-up notes showing change of address, most of them to zip codes outside the Creighton target area. 2 had no follow-up at all. She built it into a documented timeline with patient ID numbers redacted and sent it to Prescott at 11:15. He responded in 4 minutes. This is significant. Thank you. She didn't sleep well. The apartment was quiet in the way that unfamiliar places are quiet. Every creak slightly wrong, every ambient sound slightly off from what she'd calibrated to on Leicester Street. She lay on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling and thought about Paulina behind the counter with her arms wrapped around herself. She thought about the man on the phone who'd called at 7:40 to suggest her memory was flexible. She thought about Selig reading her reports and typing low priority with the indifferent facility of someone for whom other people's emergencies had long since become administrative. She woke at 5:30, ran through the workout she could do in the space available, and was at the laptop by 6. At 8:12, Okafor called. "Voss is talking," she said. Nora sat up straighter. "When?" "He came in an hour ago with his attorney. Voluntary. He says he wants a cooperation agreement before Thursday." Her voice was controlled, but something in it had changed from the night before. A quality of forward momentum, like a current that had been building and was now finally moving at the speed it had been building toward. "His attorney contacted us at 6 a.m. It means Voss knows the warrants are coming and he's trying to be first." "What does he have?" "We're in the room with him right now. But in the first 20 minutes, he confirmed the consulting payment structure and named 2 HRPD commanders above his level who were receiving payments." A pause. He also confirmed that Pruitt and Dillard were specifically assigned to the Merchant Street corridor, which includes the Starlight Diner, 4 months ago. The assignment came from above Voss. Nora thought about Pruitt walking into the diner, the specific way he'd scanned the room, the way his eyes had landed on her like he'd been looking for something to find. "Was I a target?" she said. Specifically. A silence that lasted 3 seconds. "We're still in the room. I'll call you back." She held the phone after Okafor hung up and looked at the courtyard below. Gray morning, a woman crossing with a dog on a leash, a maintenance worker with a leaf blower who hadn't started it yet. The question sat in her like something lodged. She'd been framing the diner as incident, as encounter, as the moment the whole thing had surfaced into visibility. The possibility that it hadn't been random, that Pruitt had been sent to that specific corridor on a specific night for reasons that may have included her, rearranged things in ways she was still working through when Okafor called back 18 minutes later. "You weren't specifically targeted by name," Okafor said. According to Foss, Pruitt's general directive was to increase pressure on the Merchant Street area. It's a block and a half from the last significant cluster of Creighton acquisition targets. Anyone who looked like a long-term resident was to be discouraged. A pause. But Selig flagged your name 6 weeks ago, in an email to Fain. He described you as a, and I'm reading directly, potential complication if the district situation becomes visible. A potential complication. He told them about me before any of this started, Nora said. 6 weeks before the diner, Okafor confirmed. We think Fain shared it with Pruitt's handlers as part of a general awareness briefing on people in the district who might be vocal. You weren't a planned confrontation, but when Pruitt walked in that night and saw a woman in scrubs sitting alone at 2 a.m, he may have made a connection. She paused. Or he may have just decided you looked like an easy target and it was pure coincidence. Foss doesn't know that level of detail. Does it matter? Nora said. For the case? Not really. For you personally, not really, Nora said. Let's move. Wednesday moved slowly and then very fast. The slow part was the hours between Okafor's morning briefing and early afternoon, when Nora sat with the laptop and the documentation and the particular discipline of waiting that she'd learned over years of understanding that timing was not always the same thing as urgency. She went through the financial records Prescott sent her, redacted to the level she was cleared for but detailed enough to read, and built a secondary timeline that cross-referenced Creighton's acquisition dates against the patient displacement records from Delmore. The correlation was close to 80%. She sent it to Prescott with a note. He responded, "We already have it. Yours is cleaner. We're using yours." The fast part started at 2:17 when Hargrove called instead of Okafor, which was the first sign. Fain's firm is filing an emergency injunction, he said, without preamble. Motion to suppress the communication records on Fourth Amendment grounds. They're claiming the server warrant was improperly scoped. Can they make it stick? Their attorney is very good. It won't kill us, but it may delay Thursday. He paused. There's also been a leak. What kind? A local television station is running a story tonight. They have a source inside HRPD who characterized last night's diner incident as, quote, a confrontation between an unstable healthcare worker and an officer responding to a legitimate complaint. He said it flatly, which was the only way to say it. They're planning to name you. She was quiet for a moment. She had expected something like this. In the abstract. The abstract is different from the specific. They're going to air it tonight, she said. 7 o'clock news, our media contact is trying to get them to hold, but they're not obligated to. He paused. The story also references the complaint from the physician at Delmore. Greer. The dismissed complaint, the one she'd told Webb about, the one that was still in her file even though it had been found without merit, the kind of thing that sounds like something to people who aren't reading it closely enough to know it's nothing. Who's the source inside HRPD? She said. We believe it's Dellard. A pause. Pruitt's partner. He hasn't been called in yet. He's not on the primary warrant list. He's trying to get ahead of it. Yes. She thought for a moment. Okafor said my testimony was the through line, the statement I gave combined with Webb's account and the financial records. She kept her voice level. If Dellard's story goes out tonight and my name is attached to a characterization of instability before Thursday's arrests, it muddies the water, Hargrove said. Not fatally, but enough to give defense attorneys material. She held the phone and looked at the courtyard. The maintenance worker had moved on. The woman with the dog was long gone. The sky had gone the particular low-ceiling gray of a city afternoon in November. I want to give a statement, she said. On camera, tonight, before 7. A silence. Nora. I have medical documentation of my injuries. I have a timeline. I have the recording Okafor made of my formal statement, which is a federal document. I am a credentialed emergency nurse with a clean employment record and a dismissed complaint that is in my file with the word dismissed next to it. She kept her voice from tightening. If Dellard's version goes out uncontested, it becomes the first version, and the first version is the one people remember. Another silence, longer. She heard him cover the phone and say something to someone. Then, I need to talk to Okafor. Talk fast, she said. It's 4:15. She was in front of a camera by 5:40. not a press conference. Okafor had drawn the line there. A single reporter from a separate station, one that Okafor's media contact trusted, in a neutral location, with Thomas in the room, and a DOJ attorney present to manage what could be said without compromising Thursday's operation. Nora wore what she'd been wearing all day, clean but not performed, her hair back, the bruise on her forearm visible at the edge of her sleeve, which she'd made no effort to hide. The reporter, a woman in her 40s named Carr, who had the focused economy of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know which questions mattered, led with the basic facts of Tuesday night and let Nora tell it. She told it the same way she'd told it to Okafor. Linear, specific, without ornamentation. She didn't use charged language, didn't perform emotion, didn't make arguments. She described what had happened in sequence and let the sequence do what sequences do when they're accurate. She held up her arm when Carr asked about her injuries. She confirmed the medical documentation existed and had been submitted to federal investigators. She confirmed she had given a formal recorded statement. When Carr asked about the dismissed complaint from Delmore, she said, "That complaint was reviewed, found without merit, and dismissed. Those are the facts as they appear in the record." She paused. Anyone saying otherwise is not reading the record. It aired at 6:42. She watched it in the apartment on the laptop, sitting on the edge of the bed, and she looked ordinary and specific and completely steady. And she had not performed any of that, which was the only way to do it. Her phone started buzzing at 6:50 with numbers she didn't recognize. She didn't answer. At 7:03, Okafor texted, "Dellard Station is holding the story." They didn't air. She set the phone down. Then, at 7:17, a text came from a number she hadn't seen before, no name attached. That was not Okafor, and not Thomas, and not anyone from the federal building. It said, "You should have taken the deal when it was offered. What comes next is on you." She stared at it. Then she screenshotted it, timestamped it, and sent it to Okafor with a single line. "This just came in, not a prepaid this time. Trace it." Okafor's response came in 40 seconds. "Already on it. Don't reply. Lock the door and stay put." Nora locked the door. She stood in the center of the room and breathed through it, counted, the way she'd learned in a different context for a different kind of pressure. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out. The text was not a threat she could evaluate clearly yet. It could be Dellard, it could be Fain, it could be someone further up who hadn't been visible yet, someone whose name hadn't appeared in any of the documents she'd read. What comes next is on you, which meant they still had something that hadn't been played yet, held in reserve, and they believed it was enough to change what happened Thursday. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the courtyard below, dark now, just the building lights edging the space. She ran through everything she'd given Okafor, everything in the timeline, every document and statement and piece of her life she'd laid open over the last 36 hours, trying to find the gap, the thing she'd missed, the variable she hadn't accounted for. And then her laptop chimed with an email from Prescott, marked urgent, and when she opened it, she understood what they were holding. The email contained a single attachment, a screenshot of a bank record, pulled from a joint account that Nora had not thought about in 4 years, had barely thought about since she'd separated from service, had not mentioned to anyone in this investigation because she hadn't believed it was relevant, an account she'd held with a person who was not a clean name, a person she'd been close to in the last months of her deployment, who had, after she'd separated, been investigated for procurement fraud involving military contracts. An investigation she had been interviewed in as a witness, had cooperated fully with, and had been cleared from entirely. But the account existed. The name on it existed. And at the bottom of Prescott's email, he'd written, "This record was leaked to Fain's attorney 40 minutes ago. Source unknown. We're working on it. Wanted you to know first." She sat down slowly. They had found the one thing in her history that was true, that was documentable, and that was just complicated enough to require explanation. And they had given it to the defense 20 hours before the warrants went out. She read Prescott's email 3 times, not because the words changed, but because she was doing what she'd been trained to do when new intelligence arrived that reframed existing information. She was holding it still and turning it, looking at all its surfaces before she let herself react to any of them. The account was real. She and a man named Dwight Harlan had opened it during a deployment rotation, a practical arrangement for shared expenses during a period when they'd been stationed at the same forward operating base for 7 months, and had been, in the way that proximity and pressure and the particular loneliness of certain assignments sometimes produced, close in a way she didn't fully know how to categorize even now. When she'd separated from service, she'd meant to close it. She hadn't. It had sat with a zero balance and then a negative balance from a dormancy fee. And then she'd paid the fee and forgotten about it again, and Harlan had subsequently been investigated for procurement fraud that had nothing to do with her, and she had given a full witness interview and been cleared and moved on. All of that was true. All of it was documentable. And none of it was simple to explain in 40 seconds to someone who wanted it to be something it wasn't. She picked up her phone and called Okafor directly. "I know," Okafor said before Nora had spoken. "The account was a joint personal account from a deployment. I was cleared from his investigation entirely. The clearance is on record." "I know that too." "Then what's the actual exposure?" A pause. "Fain's attorney is going to argue that your proximity to a procurement fraud investigation, combined with a joint financial account, suggests a pattern of poor judgment that calls your reliability as a witness into question." She said it cleanly, without editorializing, the way you say something when you want the person on the other end to hear the shape of the problem without the distortion of your own reaction to it. It won't work, but it will take time to counter, and time is what they're buying. Nora sat on the edge of the bed. "How much time?" Fain's attorney filed a motion tonight requesting a 48-hour delay on the warrants pending a judicial review of the witness credibility question. Another pause. "The motion is thin. Our DOJ attorney gives it maybe a 30% chance of being granted." 30%, Nora said. "In 48 hours, what happens to Foss's cooperation agreement?" "It weakens. He's already scared. 2 more days of exposure gives his own attorney time to renegotiate." Okafor's voice stayed even. "And it gives Aldrin time to move assets." There it was. Aldrin. The name at the top of the corporate structure, the man through 7 layers of subsidiaries, the actual architect of what had been done to Harlow Ridge for 22 months. If the delay held and Aldrin moved money or personnel or documentation out of the accessible range of the warrants, the case against the top of the operation collapsed into something that prosecuted the middle and left the source intact. Nora looked at the courtyard. Dark, quiet, just the building light edging the window frame. She thought about what she'd said to Webb that morning. "I need to know the people he was working for can't just find the next Pruitt and start over." She'd meant it when she said it. She still meant it. "The clearance documentation from Harlan's investigation," she said. "Where does it live?" "Military records, JAG office, 3rd Corps." "I have a copy," Nora said. "I kept a copy of every document from that process. It's in a folder in my apartment." A brief silence. "You're not going back to your apartment tonight." "I know where the folder is. I know exactly which drawer. If Thomas or someone from your team can get there and pull it, it's the 2nd drawer of the filing cabinet in the bedroom closet, green hanging folder marked admin." She stopped. "The document you want is the formal clearance letter from the JAG investigator, dated, signed, unambiguous. It says cleared. It says no further action. It says her cooperation was complete and her conduct was consistent with the duties of her rank." Okafor was already moving. She could hear the change in ambient sound, the quality of air shifting around the phone the way it does when someone stands up and starts walking. "I'll have someone there in 20 minutes. There's also a personnel commendation letter in the same folder, from the unit commander. Different situation. It's from a classified action. The citation is sealed, but the letter itself references her record in general terms." "Oh," she paused. "Bring that too." "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to give Fain's attorney something to look at," Nora said, "because right now they have a joint bank account and a name. I want them to have context. The full picture tends to complicate the argument." She didn't sleep. She sat at the laptop and built what Okafor had started calling the credibility brief. A structured document that laid out, in clear and unemotional sequence, the complete account of her relationship to Dwight Harlan, the nature of the joint account, the timeline of his investigation, her voluntary cooperation, and her clearance. She attached the timeline of her military service, the dates of her deployments, the commendations that were publicly citable. She did not make arguments. She assembled facts and let them be facts. At midnight, Thomas brought the folders from her apartment and sat with her while she pulled the relevant documents and scanned them with the laptop's camera, building a complete packet that Okafor's DOJ attorney could put in front of a judge in the morning. Thomas didn't say much. He made coffee from the apartment's small machine, put a cup beside her without asking, and when she looked up from the laptop at 1:30 with her eyes dry from the screen, he said, "You know this is going to work." "I know the evidence is right," she said. "That's not the same thing." "It usually is." "Usually," she agreed. He didn't push it. She appreciated that about him. He'd had that quality from the beginning, the ability to be present without filling space unnecessarily. It was a skill she'd come to understand, and not a common one. By 2 a.m., the brief was done. She sent it to Okafor, to Prescott, and to the DOJ attorney whose name was Whitmore, and who had been awake apparently since before Nora had gone in front of the camera, because his response came back in 6 minutes with 3 annotations and 1 question, all of which she answered, and then he wrote, "This is sufficient. I'll have it in front of the judge at 8. She closed the laptop, looked at the dark courtyard, thought about the fact that somewhere in this city, in whatever apartment or hotel or house Victor Aldrin was currently occupying, people were working through the night on the other side of this, reading the same legal landscape she and Whitmore were reading, looking for the same gaps from the opposite direction. She didn't know him. She'd never heard his name before 2 days ago, but she understood him the way you understand a type rather than a person. Someone who had looked at a city and calculated what it was worth in parcels, who had identified the people most likely to be dismissed if they complained and built an operation on that dismissal, who had been running this so long and so successfully that being stopped had probably started to feel like something that happened to other operations, not his. She thought about Paulina behind the counter, the cracked mug on the diner floor, the 14 emails Selig had sent with low priority in the subject line. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of problem that powerful people tried to make small enough to ignore. Then she stopped thinking about it and went to lie down because she needed to be functional in the morning, and thinking about it further wasn't going to add anything that wasn't already in the brief. The judicial review happened at 8:15. Whitmore called her at 9:02. "Motion denied," he said. Judge Ferris reviewed the clearance documentation and the personnel record and found the credibility challenge insufficient to warrant delay. A pause, and in it she could hear something she hadn't heard in Whitmore's voice before. Not quite warmth, but the particular quality of professional satisfaction that people in his line of work rarely let out in public. He described the motion as, quote, "an attempt to delay legitimate federal process through the weaponization of selectively presented background information." She exhaled. "Just once, just enough." "Warrants execute at 7 a.m. tomorrow," Whitmore said. 22 hours. She thanked him and hung up and sat in the quiet of the apartment for a long moment. Then she got up, made coffee, drank it, looking at the courtyard in the early morning light. Gray still, November still, but the gray had a different quality than it had the night before. Or maybe that was just her. Thursday arrived the way significant days sometimes do. Unremarkably at first, the city going about its ordinary motions, people getting coffee and driving to work and arguing about parking, the whole ordinary machinery of a place where 60,000 people were trying to live their lives, most of them unaware of what was moving underneath the surface of the morning. Nora knew from Okafor. She'd been told the sequence, the timing, the teams. She wasn't part of the execution. That wasn't her role, and she understood it wasn't her role, which didn't make the waiting easier, but made it manageable. She sat in the apartment and watched the clock and did the exercise routine she'd been doing every morning for years, which helped, and ate the breakfast Thomas brought up without tasting much of it, which helped less. At 7:14, Okafor texted, "Fain in custody." At 7:22, Selig in custody. Delmore General has been notified by DOJ. At 7:31, Pruitt arrested at his residence. Dellard is turning himself in voluntarily per his attorney. At 7:49, a longer message. Foss's full cooperation formally locked. He named 2 additional HRPD commanders this morning. Both are being processed now. Foss also provided direct testimony connecting Aldrin to operational decisions. Enough for the federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges to hold at the top. She read that one twice. Enough to hold at the top. At 8:03, Aldrin taken into federal custody at Harlow Ridge Airport. He was boarding a private aircraft. She set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked out at the courtyard, where the maintenance worker was back with the leaf blower, which he had apparently decided to use today, and the noise of it came through the window glass as a low, persistent drone that was somehow exactly right for the moment, loud and ordinary and completely indifferent to the magnitude of what had just happened. She felt something loosen in her chest. She didn't have a name for the specific thing that loosened, but she recognized it. She'd felt it before, in different circumstances. The particular physical release that follows sustained high alert, the body deciding it's allowed to change registers. It wasn't happiness exactly. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something more honest than either of those. The recognition that a thing had been seen through. That the distance between what she'd known was true and what the world had been willing to acknowledge had finally, through sustained and unglamorous effort, been closed. She picked up the phone and called her sister, who answered on the third ring, sounding like she was at work, which she was. "Hey," Nora said. "Hey, are you okay? You sounded weird the other day. What's going on?" "I'm fine," Nora said. Then, because her sister had always been able to tell the difference, "I'll explain everything. Not right now, but soon. I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "Nora?" "I'm fine," she said again, and this time the word meant what it was supposed to mean, which was a change from the last time she'd said it. Yeah. She met with Okafor at the federal building at noon, in the same fourth-floor conference room where she'd given her first full statement, which felt like a different era even though it had been 3 days. The room looked the same. The river through the window looked the same. But Okafor sat differently. Still composed, still precise, but without the forward-leaning tension of someone managing a situation that could go any number of wrong directions. "Aldrin's attorney is already talking," Okafor said, "which means the case against him is solid enough that even his own people know it. What are the charges?" "Federal wire fraud, RICO conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. That covers the phone call to you, the photograph, the text message Wednesday night." She opened a folder. For Pruitt specifically, civil rights violations under color of law, assault, and 3 counts of filing false incident reports going back 14 months. She paused. Fain is looking at obstruction, conspiracy, and potentially aiding and abetting the witness intimidation charges. Selig has been placed on administrative leave pending a full DOJ audit of Delmore General's administrative practices, and the hospital board has opened an independent investigation. Nora listened to all of it. She'd wanted specifics, named consequences, not vague gestures toward accountability. And here they were, each one landing with the particular weight of things that had been earned rather than granted. "The Norwood Avenue Veterans Clinic," she said, "the one in the acquisition target area. Still operating, Creighton's pending contracts in that corridor have been frozen by court order as of this morning. The properties that were already acquired are being reviewed for evidence of fraudulent inducement. If they find it, and our preliminary review suggests they will, there are grounds for forced divestment." Okafor looked at her. "It's a long process. It doesn't undo what was already done to the people who left, but it stops it from going further." Nora nodded. "And my record?" "All complaints filed against you in connection with this case are formally withdrawn and sealed. The dismissed complaint from Greer remains in your file as dismissed. We cannot remove it, but the DOJ has issued a formal letter of record stating that an attempt was made to weaponize it as part of a coordinated witness intimidation campaign." She slid a document across the table. "That letter becomes part of your official record. Wherever the Greer complaint goes, that letter goes with it." Nora picked up the document. "Read it." The language was precise and cold and formal, and said, in the dry vocabulary of institutional accountability, that Nora Callahan had been targeted, that the targeting had failed, and that the record would reflect both facts permanently. She set it back down. "There's one more thing," Okafor said, "and this one's not from my office." She opened a second folder and pushed it across. Inside was a letter on military stationery, signed by General Marcus Webb, dated that morning. Nora read it. It was a formal commendation, not classified, not sealed. Public record. It described, in the specific and authorized language of such documents, the actions of Sergeant First Class Nora Callahan on the night of the Starlight Diner incident. The medical intervention that had stabilized a senior military officer during a cardiac event, performed under personal duress and following unprovoked physical assault, without resources, without assistance, and without hesitation. It described her subsequent cooperation with the federal investigation, the sustained intimidation campaign directed at her during that cooperation, and her decision to remain engaged in the face of it. The final paragraph recommended her for formal recognition by the Department of Veterans Affairs Community Health Initiative, and attached to the letter was a separate document. A formal appointment to the advisory board of a newly established Veteran and Community Healthcare Liaison Program covering the Harlow Ridge Metropolitan District. She read it twice. "He didn't have to do this," she said. "No," Okafor agreed. "He didn't." She looked at the letter for another moment. She thought about Webb lying on the hospital bed, asking her what she needed, and how strange the question had felt at the time. How long it had been since anyone had asked her that in a way that assumed the answer would be something more than nothing, or "I'm fine." "Tell him thank you," she said. "You can tell him yourself. He's been discharged. He'd like to see you, if you're willing." Webb was in a hotel on the north end of the city, a quiet, mid-range place that suited someone who wasn't trying to make a statement about where they were staying. His room had a view of the same river she'd been looking at for 3 days, which was starting to feel like the river was following her, or she was following it. He looked better. Still moving carefully, still wearing the particular caution of a body that had been reminded of its limits. But the color was right, and the eyes were exactly what they'd been on the floor of the diner. Sharp, assessing, not missing anything. "Sit down," he said. "You look like you've been awake for 3 days." 2.5, she said. She sat. He'd ordered coffee, which the cardiologist had apparently limited to 1 cup a day, and he was making the most of it with the deliberate attention of a man rationing a resource. He watched her for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider it. "Like something finished," she said. "I'm not sure what comes after that." "I know that feeling," he said. "I've retired twice. Both times the same thing. The work stops, and the absence of it is loud." He set down the cup. "That's why the advisory board position isn't ceremonial." "I didn't assume it was." "Good. Because it's not. The program is new, underfunded, and politically fragile, and it's going to need someone who understands both the medical side and the institutional side and doesn't flinch when the two are in conflict." He looked at her. "That's a fairly specific combination." She thought about the Veterans Clinic on Norwood Avenue, still open, still operating. She thought about the intake process she'd walked 3 people through, the car ride she'd given the man who had no other way to get there. She thought about 23 patients in her clinical notes, their zip codes shifting east across the city over 30 months, and the invisible line between what the data showed and what anyone with the authority to act had been willing to acknowledge. "It would mean leaving the ER," she said. It wasn't an objection. It was a fact she was holding up to the light to see how it looked from different angles. "Partially," he said. "The position is structured to allow clinical practice. We were deliberate about that. People in these roles burn out when they lose the ground-level work. They start thinking in abstractions and stop thinking about individuals. We didn't want that." He paused. "You'd keep your nights if you wanted them." She looked at the river. Gray-brown, moving at its own pace, doing what rivers do, carrying everything downstream without appearing to work at it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." She turned back to him. "You nearly died on the floor of a diner." "I'm aware." "And the first thing you did when you could sit up straight was make calls on behalf of a witness you'd known for 4 hours." He looked at her with an expression that was almost amused. "I've been in this business a long time, Nora. I know what good judgment looks like. I know what it costs when it's ignored." He picked up his cup again. "You didn't leave. Most people leave." "I had nowhere to go," she said, which was half true, and the other half was something she didn't have language for yet. "People with nowhere to go still leave," he said. "The leaving isn't about destination. It's about what it costs to stay." She held that for a moment. Take the position, he said. Don't take it, but don't let the last 3 days be the whole story. He set the cup down. You've been the most dangerous piece of evidence in a federal case. That's a role that has a beginning and an end. What you were before it and what you are when it's over, that's longer. Tot. She went back to her apartment on Friday afternoon. Leicester Street looked like itself. The same building, the same superintendent's car in the lot, the same fire escape with the third rung that was slightly off true. She stood outside for a moment and looked at it the way you sometimes look at a place you've been away from, checking whether it matches what you remembered or whether you've changed enough that the mismatch is yours now. It matched. That was something. She went up the stairs, unlocked the door, stood in the entryway. The folder Thomas had pulled from her bedroom closet was back, placed neatly on the kitchen counter. The apartment smelled like it always did. A specific combination of old building and her own particular occupancy. The smell of a life accumulated quietly over 2 years. She opened the window in the living room, let the November air in. It was cold, but not bitterly. Just the ordinary cold of a city moving toward winter, doing what cities do. She sat on the couch and looked at the room. She thought about all the things she hadn't told anyone in the last 3 days for reasons that were partly operational and partly just the ingrained habit of a person who'd learned to ration what she shared. She thought about the joint account in Harlan and the 7 months at the forward operating base and all the decisions she'd made then that had been made in the context of a life she was no longer living. She thought about the way Fane's attorney had tried to make that into a story and how the attempt had failed and how it had still been unpleasant to have a stranger pick up something true and private and try to make it into something it wasn't. She thought about Pruitt's hands on her arm, the force of it, the presumption underneath the force, the particular presumption of someone who has operated for a long time in a world where that kind of contact doesn't have consequences, where the person on the receiving end isn't expected to push back, isn't expected to know people in rooms with federal authority, isn't expected to be anyone other than what she appeared to be. She'd appeared to be a tired nurse. She was something else entirely. And the version of her that walked out of this week was different from the one that had walked into the Starlight Diner, not because she'd become someone new, but because something external had finally caught up with something internal that had been there all along. The gap had closed. The record would reflect it. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd felt triumphant once or twice in her life, in circumstances that had immediately been complicated by what came next, and she'd learned that triumphant was a feeling you could afford to have for about 20 minutes before it became something you had to put down in order to keep moving. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, something that had to do with the specific knowledge that she'd been right, not just in the operational sense, not just in the legal sense, but in the moral sense, which was the one that was hardest to sustain under the particular pressure of people with power, insisting you were wrong. She'd held the line on what she knew to be true when holding it had been uncomfortable, and then costly, and then actively dangerous, and it had remained true through all of it. That was the thing they couldn't touch. That was the thing that no motion to suppress or photograph taken from across a street or phone call about flexibility could reach, because it lived in a register that evidence doesn't have access to. She'd known what she'd seen, she'd said what she'd seen, and the world had been required eventually to catch up. She picked up her phone and called Okafor. "I wanted you to know," she said. "I'm taking the advisory board position." A brief pause. "Good," Okafor said. "I'll let Webb know. Don't make it a thing." "I won't." A pause. "Nora, for what it's worth, I've worked with a lot of people in situations like this. Most of them are fine. A few of them are good." She paused once more, and in the pause was something that Okafor probably didn't distribute widely. "You were the right person in the right place, and I'm glad you didn't take the deal." Nora thought about the voice on the phone, smooth and unnamed, talking about flexibility. She thought about how simple it would have been to take the path that voice was offering, to decide that what happened in the diner wasn't worth what it was going to cost, to walk back her statement, to let the quiet settlement of an unofficial arrangement absorb the whole incident like it had absorbed so many incidents before. She thought about Paulina saying no. Nobody called, in a voice that cracked only once. "I wasn't going to take it," she said. "I know," Okafor said. That's why I'm saying it. 6 months later, the Norwood Community Health and Veterans Liaison Center opened in a converted building 2 blocks from the clinic that Creighton had been trying to acquire. It wasn't a grand opening in the way of things that want to be photographed. It was practical and a little chaotic. A ribbon cutting with city officials who were mostly new officials, given that the previous cycle of relevant decision-makers was in various stages of federal prosecution, and a reception that ran over time because the building's HVAC hadn't been fully calibrated yet, and it was warm in a way that made people hold their coats and look slightly uncomfortable. Nora stood near the back during the speeches. She'd been invited to speak, had declined, had agreed to say a few words, and had then kept those words to a minimum because the people in the room who needed to hear something said were not there for her story. They were there for the clinic, for the intake counselor who'd been hired away from a nonprofit in another city and had already started building a referral network, for the 3 exam rooms that were small but functional, for the Veterans Services Desk, which was staffed by a woman named Rosario who had once been a client of the Norwood Avenue Clinic and now worked for this one. She was there for all of that, not for the narrative of how it had come to exist. After the speeches, after the ribbon, after the plates of food that the staff had organized and the coffee that the building had learned to make properly by then, Webb found her near the window that looked out over the street. He was moving better. Still cautious, still carrying his body with the awareness of someone who'd been reminded that it had limits, but the careful quality of it had become less like restraint and more like respect. "You look like you belong here," he said. She looked at the room. Rosario at the intake desk already talking to someone. The counselor showing a man in his 50s the resources board. 2 kids running between the chairs while their grandmother talked to a nurse in the corner. "It's a good room," she said. "It is." He stood beside her for a moment. The Creighton acquisitions are being reversed. It's slow and it's contested, and 3 of the smaller investors are trying to claim they didn't know the full picture, but the court isn't buying it. He paused. The Merchant Street corridor, the area around the Starlight, is zoned for community use now. City Council passed it last month. She looked out the window. The street ran east toward where the diner would be if you kept walking, which she sometimes did, in the early mornings before her advisory board work started, just to have the walk. Paulina was still there. They'd gotten coffee twice. Gus was still on the grill. "Pruitt," she said, "convicted on 5 counts. 18 months, minimum security, 3 years probation. He'll lose the pension." Webb said it without satisfaction and without regret. Just as the set of facts it was. Fain accepted a plea deal, disbarred pending the criminal sentence. Selig resigned before the board could remove him and is facing federal charges separately. A pause. Aldrin goes to trial in the fall. His attorneys are good, but the record is complete. Foss's testimony alone would be enough. She nodded. She'd read most of this in Okafor's updates, but there was a different quality to hearing Webb say it. Not more authoritative, just more present, the way being in a room with someone changes the weight of information. "Thank you," she said, "for the commendation, for the position." She paused. "For not letting me refuse help in the hospital room." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You've thanked me twice now." "It's a short list of things I'm thanking you for." "Good." He looked out the window. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to take it at face value rather than deflecting." She waited. "What you did, in the diner, and after, and during the 2 days in between, most people don't do that." He kept his eyes on the street. Not because they can't, because they decide it's not worth it. Because the cost of being right when the wrong people are in the room is too high, and the reward for staying quiet is immediate. He turned to look at her. "You decided differently, and 62 people who live within a half-mile of where we're standing are still in their homes because you decided differently." She didn't deflect. She received it, the way she'd been learning to receive things. Not as a performance of humility, not as an absorption of credit, but as information about what actions had produced, which was its own kind of accountability and its own kind of purpose. "It was one night in a diner," she said. "It was one night in a diner," he agreed. "And then it was 2 days of not stopping. Those are the same thing." She looked back at the room. Rosario was handing someone a folder. The counselor was on the phone. One of the kids had given up running and was now sitting on a chair eating something, completely absorbed. The thing about this kind of work? The long kind. The kind that didn't look like anything from the outside. The kind that happened in clinical notes and formal statements, and documented timelines and emails sent at 2 in the morning to people who wrote back with annotations. The thing about it was that it didn't have a moment. There was no frame in which you could stand and feel it complete. The completeness was distributed across everything, across all the small decisions made by the right people at the right time, and you only ever saw a piece of it, and the piece you saw was usually the piece closest to you. She'd seen the diner. She'd seen Paulina's voice crack on no. She'd seen the bruise on her own forearm and the schedule in Salas's notebook, and the look on Fane's face when he'd recognized her in a room he hadn't expected her to be in. She'd seen 14 emails with low priority in the subject line, and now she was seeing this room, this Tuesday morning, this specific and ordinary collection of people trying to get access to care they needed, in a building that was standing because someone had refused to leave when the pressure said to leave, and because someone else had said no, nobody called, in a voice that only cracked once, and because a retired general had kept asking what she needed, and because 7 people who'd gone quiet had been followed by an 8th who hadn't. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't clean. The city still had problems that this room didn't solve and couldn't solve, and some of the people who'd been displaced were not coming back, and the legal process that was still grinding forward would be slow and imperfect and would satisfy no one completely. But this room was standing, and it would be standing tomorrow. And the people who had tried to make sure it never existed were answering for it in federal court. That was enough to work from. That was, in fact, exactly enough. She turned away from the window and went back to work.